you give me 30 seconds to just
Sure.
say that usual disclaimer. I work for the World Bank, and they want me to put out all this before before anything. So these findings, its interpretation, conclusion of the study, as well as my communications in this conversation are entirely of my own. They do not necessarily represent the views of the World Bank, its executive directors, or governments they represent.
Got
Okay.
it. Good.
All right. Now that we're through with that, just a bit about my background. So I grew up in Vietnam. I was born and raised there. I left when I was 17. Um, Immigrated to the U.S. for education, and then later on for this career in development. So I'm a microeconomist by training. I do research quite a bit on the interaction between human and the environment, and that's sort of my line of more precisely, I would say, uh, measuring causal impact of environmental shocks and stressors on human well-being. That's so that I think this study that we've been uh, that we publish and that we continue to investigate on Agent Orange or dioxin exposure is part of that larger research agenda of mine. And yeah, so happy to answer any questions.
Just so our viewers understand, what does Agent Orange and dioxin and these types of herbicides, what do they do to the human body?
Yeah, so I think this is something that's been studied a lot in the medical literature, right? It's not something that in our specific study we try to claim or make any sort of argument about our contribution to that medical literature. But within that literature, that medical or public health science, right? It's been shown that herbicides are basically containing dioxins, right? Agent Orange is one type of it. Uh, it's the application of it has been linked to extremely harmful biological effects, right, on the human body. And so you're talking about cancer, much greater likelihood of exposing to cancer, right? There's, I think, now a sufficient medical linkage between dioxin exposure to various types of cancer or lymphoma. You're talking about chronic leukemia, lung cancers. These are all medical studies showing this evidence. There are also side effects related to cardiovascular disease, right? Hypertension, greater likelihood of strokes and heart disease, or Parkinson, right? Neurological disorders. All these in the medical field, they have shown. And what we do in this exercise that we do in this study is we rely on that medical studies in all these medical evidence to show potentially the population-wide effect. Because of the fact that you have this medical linkage between dioxin exposure uh, on a biological human body, right? It doesn't really mean that the application of dioxin during the war would cause a population-wide impact. That's something, and precisely because of that fact, there have been numerous lawsuits, right, related to, both from both sides, I would say, from the Vietnamese government on behalf of their population, as well as from the Vietnam War U.S. veterans against the use of, again, chemical warfare, right, during the war. You see that aftermath here too for for um, for U.S. veterans who participated in the war and their family, their descendants, because this is a disease that's been shown to pass through generations.
Tell me about your study specifically. What did you and your partners find that wasn't previously understood as well? And I've read it, and I know it has a lot to do with just the general impact on the population in Vietnam. So just explain the findings that you found through your study.
Yeah. So that's really related to what I've just mentioned, right? We basically contribute to this established medical literature on the impact of dioxin or Agent Orange in particular, right, on human well-being by looking at a population-wide health survey that was done back in 2002 in collaboration between the Vietnamese government and the World Bank. That surveyed about over 200,000 respondents in the countries, asking them numerous questions related to different aspects of their of health and even social well-being. So it's a master. It's a big data set that was administered back then, and we combine that with a classified war-related data set, right, on the application of Agent Orange or the disposal of Agent Orange by U.S. military in Vietnam during the war in a long period, stressing across the entire period of the war since the 1950s to the mid 1970s, and so we provide that causal linkage to that channel, and well, the fact that we study this, we were not really also the first group of researchers trying to really discover whether application of dioxin would create large-scale impact on the population to those who were directly exposed during the war, as well as to their offsprings and descendants, right? People who were born after the war by families or parents that were exposed, right? We were not the first. We documented in our study, there were at least 2 or 3 studies in terms of working papers trying to establish this causal or causality, right? But not entirely successful because of the fact that causality in all of these social science studies required more than 2 events being correlated to each other, right? The fact that you see a location being more exposed to Agent Orange or Agent Orange intensity, right? And the fact that their populations more damage or the prevalence of disease medically linked to Agent Orange or dioxin exposures. The fact that you see those 2 events happening or correlated to each other doesn't mean that one could cause another, right? So to overcome that sort of causality claim, we rely on a very interesting but also very important fact that most of the disposure of dioxins or herbicides in general during the war by the U.S. military, the main purpose of those activities was to defoliate forests and jungles, basically with 2 sort of main purposes, right? First is to dispose the North Vietnamese infiltrators during that time. So a lot of them established bases, trying to establish bases, right, within South Vietnam's around or inside these jungles, to cover their presence. So this herbicides were mainly applied to do that, to dispose the infiltrator from the north during the war. So that sort of war-related historical really event, right? It doesn't really have anything to do with futures health. Let's say medical performance of the population years later. And so we use that, and in our language of analysis, it sort of serves as an instrumental variable that helps overcome this potential endogeneity or basically helping to prove that two events happening, uh, we can claim that one really causes another to happen. In this case, dioxin exposure causes greater likelihood or greater prevalence uh, of the population suffering from disease linked to Agent Orange.
You mentioned there in the beginning of your comments that it's not just the people who were exposed, but also their children are part of this equation as well. And I don't know that that is um, as well known as it should. What have you learned on how that works and how prevalent that is if a parent has been exposed and has a condition, how that could be passed on to their children?
Yes. So again, this is also this sort of multi-generational effect of dioxin exposure has been a subject of study for a long time now, and researchers from the medical and the public health uh, sciences, right? They have been they've done this studies, you know, varying on varying samples of exposed. Most of the study, I could say, have been done in the U.S. Um, with the sample of respondents being precisely veterans of the war, right? And basically try and see if there's a greater likelihood of offsprings or children and even to the third generation, right, grandchildren of individuals who participated during the war, uh, whether they were more likely or they are more likely or not suffering from disease related to Agent Orange. I could say that precisely what you mentioned, that literature, that evidence base, it's not as rigorous and established as the direct effect on those who are exposed. But that's there, and we mentioned that in our study too, that's there. Now, there's a lot less evidence in Vietnam, right? Because you don't have these large scale sort of scientific support to perform any sort of, very precise surveys or asking population there on what kind of effects that they suffer and their children suffer. So there's a shortage there on medical linkage or on the population-wide effect of dioxin exposure. Precisely that's sort of sort of a motivation for our for us, right? To really uh, see if we can define or explore any of that aspect. And we do see some evidence. We do see that this effect, right? It's expectedly stronger. The effect of herbicide exposure is expectedly stronger for people who were born during the war, but more so for children or infants compared to adults, right? In our study, particularly, we don't really find, what we call robust and statistically significant effect of exposure on the children of those who are exposed, or the second and third generations of those who are exposed, because I think again because of the limitation that the data provided to us, right? We don't. I mean, in Vietnam, they haven't really done any um, subject-specific study or survey that directly related to Agent Orange, right? What we used was a population health census that asked multiple questions uh, directly or indirectly related to Agent Orange linked disease, but not precisely on that topic. So, to that extent, I think in order to really establish a more rigorous, assessment of the impact on those who were directly exposed as well as the offsprings of them, I think the scientific community should try and see whether it's worthwhile or whether they can leverage funding support from government or multilateral organizations to carry out more and more of those and perform more rigorous assessment of the impact.
While we were there, I sent you the story that we did previously with the ambassador. While we were there in Da Nang, we visited a center where kids go during the day, where their families are at work, and it's a center for kids with disabilities. And um, you can, it take you long to be there to realize the struggles that these children have. And according to the ambassador and the people there at the center, they believe that a lot of those are caused by Agent Orange. But I understand the kind of point you're making of like there needs to be more robust study to really understand that well. Um, yeah, trying to form my question in my head a little bit. What is the feeling around that in Vietnam? I mean, obviously you have children who have disabilities everywhere, but obviously you mentioned the prevalence of it in specific
Yeah.
areas and those kind of things. How do you see that? How do you understand that?
Yeah, no, I mean, while I was there during my earlier years, I had these opportunities to visit locations that you mentioned, right? I'm sure you are aware there are children's villages sponsored by, you know, money support for uh, bilateral or multilateral money supports from different governments, right? Basically to take care of, to have a dedicated location to take care of uh, these children with biological deficiencies, right? And a lot of them, as you mentioned, believe to be linked uh, to exposure or their parents' exposures to dioxin. Um, so it's there. I mean, you could feel it. You see. I mean, it's to the point that really you locations clustered locations with children's with significantly more or the prevalence of children's being defected uh, at just substantially greater than other locations. So you then have to sort of already make that sort of inference, right? That there has to be something going on. There has to be some sort of exposure within those locations that sort of do not happen elsewhere, right? Of course, establishing uh, a scientific claim to that linkage of being nearer to a place that were damaged by dioxin could give you or create a greater likelihood of having health effects. That's something that remains for researchers to really do more and more robust exercise or studies to establish that claim. But you see that there. Anecdotally, you see that there. You see children suffering, and still up until this date, you see children with disease again linked, medically linked to dioxin exposure.
I'll leave you on this thought, and I don't know how much you've studied this. Just want to throw it out there. The ambassador also talked about beyond the spraying of the herbicides during the war period, the drums of dioxin, of products with dioxin in it that were left after the war, specifically
Right.
at the Da Nang Air Base and the Bien Hoa Air Base, and how they believe that has seeped into the soil and gotten to the groundwater or the fish and these things. Um,
Right.
how much have you studied any of that thought? What can you say about any of that?
Yeah. So what we do know, and there are scientific evidence, is that there's this long lasting environmental damage of dioxins, right? these substances they last for a long time on soils, and they got carried and spread through waters, and then the consumption of those, right? Consumption of plants grown on those damaged or affected soils, or usage of even water that contains dioxin remnant, right? Are harmful to the consumers. So that's there, and that's something that's been studied. Now, to the extent of drums, right, or storage of dioxins or herbicide storage. Uh, I mean, I don't really think there has been any study at all trying to establish a causal relationship between that, between um, being, let's say, locating closer to those locations and suffering from greater disease or greater likelihood uh, of, uh, of a health disease, right, related to Agent Orange. That is there to be assessed, really. But you do see effort, I think, from both sides of the government in trying to remedy this already, right? You see removal of these storage locations, and you see attempts to really assess the environmental damage that dioxin leakages have caused to soils, to water, to the quality of plants locating or located around these areas. And that that there are studies already done, and you see strong evidence of all that dioxin